Russell T Davies has previously stated that 73 yards is the best thing he's ever written, but is that true? 73 yards sees the Doctor and Ruby landing on the Welsh coastline in modern day, where the Doctor immediately steps on a fairy circle. Seriously, the Doctor and Ruby need to start watching where they're stepping in this season. This leads to the Doctor vanishing, with Ruby being left on her own for the whole episode, constantly being followed by a mysterious woman who is always 73 yards away from her. As some of you may know, 73 yards was the episode of this season of Doctor Who that I was the most intrigued in and most excited for. For that reason, I think when I first watched this episode, it didn't quite live up to the expectations I had built up in my head for it. However, after seeing other people's takes on this episode on Twitter, particularly the negative reactions to this episode, I realised I liked it a lot more than I had first thought. And the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it. And I knew that on rewatch, I was going to enjoy this episode a lot more. With that being said, there are still a few criticisms I have for this episode, so let's get into the review. So obviously, like I said, the Doctor disappears at the start of this episode, which leaves Ruby Sunday on her own for the rest of the episode as the main character of this episode. This gives Millie Gibson the perfect opportunity to shine as Ruby Sunday in this episode, where she gives a great performance, which is really impressive considering this is the first episode she filmed of this season. If Boom is the episode that should sell you on Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor, then 73 Yards is the episode that should sell you on Millie Gibson as Ruby Sunday. So Ruby also bumps into Susan Twist again in this episode as the hiker, but this time she actually recognises her from the previous episode, forwarding this Susan Twist story arc a little bit further than it has been for the past few episodes, where the Doctor and Ruby haven't even really noticed her before. We then get a very good and tense scene in the pub. I know some people don't really like its portrayal of Welsh people, but bear in mind this is written by Russell T Davies, who is himself Welsh. I love the reveal of them just messing with Ruby. It makes you unsure of how much, if any, of what they said is actually true or real. I personally think none of it is real and it's just a red herring, but it's a really nice way of sowing some seeds of what could be happening in this episode and what the explanations could be, leaving the audience to kind of figure out which of the things they've said is actually true and actually happening. We also get the scenes with Ruby's mum, Carla, as well as Kate Stewart and Unit, where they're both turned away from Ruby after speaking to the woman, which really just shows how alone Ruby is with all this and how no one is able to help her. And the scene with Kate Stewart has a really great line in it, which I think is very important to this episode, but I'll touch on that more later on. So after all this happens, we then get a time jump to Ruby when she's about 40, I think. It is a little bit weird that the way that they've decided to age her up is basically just by putting glasses on her. I'm pretty sure from Unleashed you can see that she does technically have some prosthetics on. There's like some slight wrinkles in her forehead and stuff like that. And I think she was also coached on how to walk as if she was a 40-year-old. But that's honestly not that noticeable, so it does kind of just look like they've put some glasses on her, which is kind of funny. But for me personally, it doesn't really bother me that much. I thought Roger Ap Gwilliam was a good antagonist for this episode. My only issue is how long it takes to get to him and how little he's focused on in the episode. I know I've seen some people that aren't so happy about the whole abuse that is implied in this episode, which I fully appreciate and understand. For me, I think it really helps to show how terrible and obsessed with power he is, but I can see why those implied moments just kind of really aren't needed for some people and feel a little bit weird. In terms of Roger Ap Gwilliam himself, I think my personal interpretation is I personally like to think that he's just a normal human who is obsessed with power, and that him mentioning that his nickname was Mad Jack is just a coincidence that reminds Ruby of the Doctor mentioning him and what he did at the start of the episode. Hence why when Ruby uses the woman to make Roger Ap Gwilliam resign, she doesn't disappear until Ruby dies, as I think that's not what she was there for. I personally think there isn't actually a reason why the woman is there, but Ruby just finds one and makes one up, which I think is hinted at by what Kate says earlier on in the episode, where she says, "It's what we do, all of us. We see something inexplicable and invent the rules to make it work." However, other people obviously are going to interpret this in a different way. That Mad Jack is an entity set free by the Doctor stepping in the fairy circle that is either possessed or manifested into Roger Ap Gwilliam, which I think is just as valid of an interpretation and personally what this episode is all about. The ambiguity of elements like this is personally what makes this episode so good in my opinion, but I'll get into that more later on. But before I get into most people's main issue with this episode, I think my main issue with this episode is the pacing and the political elements that seem a little bit rushed and half-baked. They sort of come out of nowhere, and I feel like this episode could have maybe benefited from being a two-parter, especially considering you can tell that they've tried to fit a lot into this episode, and it still ended up being 47 minutes long, which is longer than all the other episodes we've got so far in this season, and they still couldn't fit a title sequence at the start of this episode, although that might have been a creative decision. Either way, I think the lack of title sequence works for this. But yeah, I do think this maybe could have benefited from being a two-parter, with part one ending with with Ruby seeing Roger Gwilliam on the TV announcing that he's running for Prime Minister, and her remembering what the Doctor said about him. And then part 2 focusing on the political elements and Ruby trying to take down Roger Gwilliam. Okay, so obviously a lot of people weren't happy with the ending of this episode as it leaves a lot of things unexplained. However, whilst I understand that criticism, it personally doesn't bother me. I personally like that this episode doesn't have an explanation for anything at the end. I think people are just so used to Doctor Who having a technobabble explanation behind it, but I think this episode really benefits from not having one, as it allows for some really unique and interesting interpretations, with people interpreting a lot of the elements of this episode in different and creative ways, such as my interpretation with Roger Gwilliam. The comparison I made on Twitter is you wouldn't watch Donnie Darko, for example, and complain that nothing in that film makes sense. The whole point of that film and this episode is that it's all up to the viewer's interpretation. The difference here is that Doctor Who is a sci-fi show that usually has a logical explanation to everything, although I guess technically Donnie Darko is sci-fi horror, which this episode sort of is as well. However, with that being said, I do understand some of the criticisms. For example, if Ruby is the woman, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum? I think that doesn't make too much sense when you think about it, but personally I don't think the solution to that would be knowing what the woman is saying. Not knowing what the woman was saying is personally one of my favourite things about this episode, as it leaves a lot to the audience's imagination, and whatever it would have been revealed to be is not going to be as good as what you could think of in your head, or what you don't know. So I really don't know what they could have done there, maybe not making Ruby be the woman or something like that, but I personally don't think finding out what the woman was saying is the solution to that. The woman also isn't played by the same person who plays the older version of Ruby, so I guess maybe Ruby only inhabits the woman's body for a short period of time at the end or something like that. I think the main difference in whether or not people came out of this episode enjoying it or not mostly came down to how people approached the episode. I feel like people who didn't really like this episode or are annoyed about the ending of this episode approached this as a mystery that was going to be solved, which isn't really their own fault. But myself, and I assume the other people who also really liked this episode, were just along for the ride and saw it as more of an episode that was taking us on a journey. A lot of people are also annoyed, saying that all of this was pointless because Ruby doesn't remember it and lost all of her character growth, but I personally disagree with that, because she says at the end of the episode that she's been to Wales 3 times instead of 2 times like she said at the start. So although she doesn't actually seem to remember any of it, it's definitely stayed with her somehow, which to me suggests that the character growth that she gets in this episode has also stayed with her, even if she can't fully remember what happened. I've also seen a lot of people saying that they hope we get more answers later on in the season about this episode, but I personally don't hope we get any answers later on in the season, and I don't think we will. Like I said, for me, the ambiguity is what makes this episode, and so explaining things later on down the line would personally ruin it for me. And I also think it just seems like this story is finished, as much as people would like some explanations for it. I just personally don't see it being revisited, and personally don't want it to be, but that's just my opinion. Overall, I think 73 Yards is a great episode that thrives on ambiguity. However, some of the political content in this episode does feel somewhat rushed and half-baked, and could have maybe benefited from being 2 parts. This episode leaves you with more questions than answers, which for the most part I think is to its benefit, and leaves you thinking about it long after it's finished. However, some of the questions do bring up some genuine criticisms, such as if the woman is meant to be Ruby, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum and turn her against herself? But for the most part, I think this episode wouldn't work without its ambiguity, as it leads to a lot of creative interpretations, which I think was intentional. With that being said, I can see why this episode didn't land for some people, especially if they approached it as a mystery to be solved instead of a journey, which is no fault of their own. Because of the high expectations I had for this episode, after my first viewing I was mostly thinking of ranking this episode underneath Boom, but the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it, and after a second viewing of this episode I really loved it. So I'm now thinking of ranking this alongside Boom in S tier. Obviously the next episode is Dot and Bubble, which from the Next Time trailer didn't get me too excited for it, but I have got a little bit more excited by some of the reviews and the ideas of class commentary, as well as just the social media commentary, which is a lot more exciting in my opinion. So I really hope I'm pleasantly surprised for that episode. But for now, if you want to watch any of my other season 1 reviews, I'll make sure to have the playlist for that linked on screen, and subscribe for my Dot and Bubble review, and if you want to get that slightly early, you can join the Patreon.